So, Sydney O'Hare,
Yes.
you're an official from the African American Museum of Iowa. What is your official title at the museum?
Yeah.
And what does your position include?
Yes. So I'm the Museum Educator. So I do all of our educational programming for both kids and adults. And then I do a lot of sort of guest lectures and public-facing sort of community-based events around
You're
the
like
state.
the kind of outreach person?
Yes.
All right. What is the history of the museum itself? When
Yeah.
did it open, and kind of what incited the opening of this museum in the community?
Yes, we get asked a lot why we're located in Cedar Rapids and not in Des Moines, like where the Central Historical Society is. So what is really interesting about our museum is we were created in 1993 by a Black church who just felt there was no set location for Black history in Iowa. And so we were really came about from a very community-based effort as opposed to like a museum professional-based effort. And so we started off as a passion project, and now we've sort of kept that momentum going as a newly renovated building that's hopefully opening, knock on wood, at the end of April. So we definitely had like a very community-based starting point, and that is why we've continued to have like this educational outreach as such an important part of the museum as a whole.
You said it was very community based. Was there any debate about where to put this, whether in Cedar Rapids or Iowa City, or was there another location discussed?
Off the top of my head, I don't think so. I think that it started off at Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, and it was just sort of their like side project. Like it was like they do church in the morning and then the museum in the afternoon, and so it kind of was started as something that they wanted to keep as like central in the Cedar Rapids area. I know every now and then people will be like, oh, you should come to Des Moines, or you should come to Waterloo, or you should come to Iowa City, and we're like, yeah, but like our roots are in Cedar Rapids. And so the like local Cedar Rapids Community Foundation and organizations that have kind of had our back the whole time, we're very loyal to them, and so we like to stay in the Cedar Rapids area. But there's definitely been talk of like what it would look like if we wanted to expand. But kind of what we're running into now is like we're just trying to stay in one spot in our new building because it's really beautiful. So we're very excited. But we have a lot of traveling exhibits that we rent out, so people still don't have to be in the Cedar Rapids area to access a lot of our resources.
Okay. I actually, that's one of the things I enjoy the most about the museum. I've been there myself, I believe twice now, and I enjoy that there's so much about the local history, primarily the Cedar Rapids area or maybe some other smaller Iowa towns, but it's not it's not telling me the national story. I enjoy that it's so local, telling me about the Black community in this specific area. I wanted to ask, Iowa in the post antebellum period was one of the I suppose one of the better states, more promising states for Black Americans. What drew in the Black population?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, kind of like the two biggest reasons that people were moving to Iowa are the cultural component of how are people treating Black Americans in Iowa? You know, like could someone rent a house? Could someone have a job? But then also the civil liberties component. And so Iowa is the first state to forcibly integrate our public school system. And we did that in 1868. So we did that almost 100 years before it became a national topic. And so that effort is really coming out of Muscatine with the Alexander Clark family. But we also start to see that even though we had to have a court case to integrate Iowa public schools, it very quickly becomes sort of a point of pride for the state. And so it's used to attract people to move here, especially after the Civil War, when we see this like huge kind of question about where is everyone going to move now that we've solved this question of slavery. Even though Missouri is a slave state, Iowa is a free state based on the Missouri Compromise. And so we start to see that a lot of formerly enslaved people are moving to Iowa because it's close to kind of where they grew up if they were coming from Missouri or Arkansas. It's not like a total change of pace, but it is a shift in like where they're going to live and where they're going to continue their lives. We do have a number of restrictions for Black Americans who are moving to Iowa. It's kind of up to debate how much they were enforced, simply because we don't really have a central city where things are happening. And since Iowa's so big, it's kind of hard to tell exactly who's getting told they have to do what. We have a couple instances where Black Americans had to pay a residential fee to move to Iowa. But we also have a couple instances where just no one asked them for the fee, so they just didn't do it, which is very fair. But because of our public education system, seems to be the biggest draw. In terms of employment opportunities, the Mississippi River plays a really important role in where Black people are moving, because they know that they'll be able to get jobs that are like kind of a step above the sharecropping opportunities they would have had in the South. So places like Davenport and Muscatine and Dubuque, the mining communities of Iowa as well are really important, because mining is so physically taxing. It has a lot of employment turnover. And so these mining organizations that are setting up in the eastern chunk of the state are kind of desperate for workers. And so they don't really care what race those workers are. Especially in Waterloo, we see Black Americans from Mississippi who are being brought in as scabs during a lot of labor uprisings, which is why we still see such a big Black population in the Waterloo area. We can trace a lot of those people to these former sharecroppers who are brought in up from Mississippi to solve a railroad dispute. So we just see sort of this growth of like Midwestern labor as the biggest draw of like, we just need someone to do these jobs. And given how the public education system is integrated so early on, I feel like that draws a lot of people to the state.
I guess that does kind of tie into the next question, which is what were some, like, I guess, government-sponsored opportunities that brought Black Americans to the state?
Yeah.
That was a lot of economic. I guess that closely ties into government, but were there any, like, actual government movements that, I guess, warranted or I guess incited an influx of the Black population?
Yeah. The first thing I can think of off the top of my mind is when Iowa was a territory, before the Civil War, before we kind of reached statehood, our first territory Supreme Court case is concerning a man who is enslaved in Missouri, is authorized to travel to Iowa to work to buy his freedom. His owner sends slave catchers after him, and there's this debate over whether or not Iowa is going to allow slave catchers to have authority in the state to operate sort of as under laws from the states they're coming from. And so in Dubuque, we get the case of Ralph. That's just like, that's all we know him as. And the territory Supreme Court, in our first court case ever in the state or in the territory, rules that slavery has no enforcement in Iowa, and so slave catchers don't have any enforcement rules in Iowa. So we kind of see right off the bat that the legal system, especially the court system, seems to be very much in favor of opening up the state of Iowa. You know, we're still going to get those stories of interpersonal and systemic racism just by the nature of the way the government is set up, like as a whole. It's not always going to be really open to Black Americans. But we have the case of Ralph. We have Clark versus the School Board of Muscatine, which desegregates our schools. And then in the 1940s, we're going to get a lot more court cases, especially out of the Des Moines area, about desegregating private accommodations. And that's with the case of Edna Griffin.
Okay. Wow, I didn't realize that the court cases had played such an important role in shaping, I guess, these systems for the state.
Yeah, it's kind of nice when you get like a win in like a system of power, when you're like, oh my God, it's working.
With the Midwest is kind of notoriously in history, there were several uprisings, and there was a very large, like the Midwest had its own civil rights movement, almost divorced from the South. In its own right. What were some of the events that took place in the Iowa City and Cedar Rapids area?
Off the top of my head, my immediate thought is I have two cases in Des Moines. One with the Katz Drugstore integration by Edna Griffin, and then the Good Park Rebellion, which is groups of young Black Americans from Des Moines who are pushing back against curfews in the park system because they don't have a community space to hang out in. In the Iowa City area, we see a lot of efforts going in to integrate more of the culture of the university as opposed to like the legal structure of the university. So the university was never officially segregated, but kind of the biggest blocking factor for Black students entering Iowa was that our dorms weren't necessarily integrated. Mm-hmm. So if you were a Black student coming from kind of anywhere outside of like the general Iowa City area, you had to find like a family friend to live with, a cousin, a brother. There wasn't open housing to the same degree that we would see like in the dorms. Mm-hmm. And so we get a woman named Helen Lemmy, who now has an elementary school named after her in the area, who opens her house as sort of like a quasi like cafeteria, boarding house, community space, so that Black students coming from outside of the general area have actual like a place to stay and someone to look out for them that you would typically get in a dorm situation. And so the dormitories eventually become integrated in the 1940s. But before that, we really don't see more of these like accommodations that you would need to be a college student, except for like within the Black community sort of rallying around the students that they can draw in.
The core of these movements was the housing situation, kind of with the university and the community back and forth between the two.
Yes.
I did have a question here about the universities. I know this kind of plays into, I should have mentioned this earlier, but Iowa kind of has the dichotomy of progress and I suppose still systemic oppression, such as like the University of Iowa admitting Black students as early as the 1870s?
Yes.
But also the housing situation, yes, making that education inaccessible. It seems like there's a pattern in Iowa where it's beneficial, but also maybe heavily segregated. There's like undertones of systemic racism. Was this what was that interaction between the community and the university like?
Yeah, I think that...
Were they on the same page, or was that a conversation back and forth that led to this progress in the area?
Oh, that's a really good question. Off the top of my head, it seems like the Black community that was existing in the Iowa City area, either as like professors or kind of like university employees, did most of the on the ground work of like pointing out these systemic failures and pointing out that Black students could technically be admitted to the university, but like unless they knew someone, they didn't have anywhere to live. I think that as we start to see the Iowa civil rights movement sort of kicking off in the 1940s, that's when the university really starts to pay attention to like, okay, well, what other things might people get mad at, and what should we kind of remedy before it turns into an Iowa City, Cedar Rapids type of movement. And so we see in the Cedar Rapids area, sort of the rebirth of their NAACP is over park access, and it's over swimming pool access. Mm-hmm. And then that turns into this emphasis on making sure that there is a Black history curriculum to some degree in the Cedar Rapids school districts. In Iowa City, it was much more focused on the university had kind of always like touted itself as an inclusive place. But where are those little things that aren't inclusive, but that are a really big deal when you put them all together? I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I think that did. Okay, I think that kind of demonstrates the back and forth. The community kind of incited change from the university.
Yes. And
the university made that change as a pillar in the community. And so it kind of, I guess, slingshotted back into the community as progress?
Yes, I would say so. I think it's tricky too because the university is so tied to the state government of like, you almost associate them as one and the same of if the state government is saying one thing but the university is doing the other thing, it like leads to a lot of weird tension, which we still see in a lot of policies, I feel like. So I know that as the state leadership would change, there would definitely be these moments where like the governor or the court system would be like, yes, like come to Iowa. We want Black Iowans. We want people to come here if they're ready to like join the state But then we also see, like, on the flip side, these restrictions around like housing and sort of public accommodation. So it's a very odd balancing act throughout history. It's very like one step forward, two steps back, which is kind of the case for all history, but it gets really confusing when you're trying to like lay it out.
It does seem very unique in Iowa, at least from what I
Yes.
haven't studied every state in the country to this degree, not having lived there, but it seems very unique to me. I'm from Texas, so it's a much different story about
Okay.
segregation and the
Yes.
community there. But in the Iowa City and Cedar Rapids area, you had mentioned earlier that there was a move in Des Moines to lift curfews on public parks as like a congregation space for Black communities. Was there anything, a movement of such in the Des Moines or like Iowa City, Cedar Rapids area similar to that? Where was the
Yes.
Black community congregating?
So we see in the Des Moines instance, because Des Moines is sort of seen as like the hub of Black Iowa, like that's where we have the majority, or not the majority, but a significant portion of Black Iowans. Their Red Line neighborhood eventually led to, it was destroyed, and then their communities, they had no like community congregation space. The story of kind of redlining and urban planning in the Iowa City, Cedar Rapids area is a little different just because it is like physically a smaller space. We don't have the redlined map for Iowa City. I wouldn't be surprised if there is one. There's one for Boone, Iowa, which we just found, which is like very random. But we have the redline map of Cedar Rapids, and what we're really seeing is the neighborhoods that are today in the Cedar Rapids area, primarily made up of people of color, are those neighborhoods that were redlined, and they tend to be redlined more in relation to like environmental factors, so like being near the factory, being near the like stinky corn treatment plant. And so in the Iowa City area, most of the kind of like Black cultural hubs are going to be places like Helen Lemmy's house. It's not necessarily like a set community center or park, but it's very much about kind of this network of who knows who. And they have kind of that benefit of being united typically around the university. But off the top of my head, I can't think of like this church or this park or this.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, that's fine. I've noticed there are many historical preservation sites in Iowa City. I'm honestly really impressed with the historical society here. They've done some incredible work in preserving these sites. Even the ones, not specifically relevant to the history of Black Americans, but there are several sites in the city relevant to Black history in the area. What kickstarts these movements to, I suppose, preserve these sites for Black history?
It is weirdly very difficult to get a site put on like the Register of Historic Places, but there's a bunch of different sort of like levels or tiers that you can get to get something commemorated. I know that there has recently been this really big push in Des Moines to commemorate a lot of their sites of civil rights movements. In the Iowa City area, I would say your best bet to get something commemorated, either like on a registry or with like a plaque brought up by the community, is really just to garner attention around it. A lot of the times, private organizations will want to sponsor that because they think it's like a really good way to keep connected with the community. And so if like there's a house or a park or something that's like, this is important, people need to know why this is here, I would say your best bet is to just raise awareness around it. And typically historical societies or public libraries have the historical data to sort of back you up and tell you, oh, it was owned by this influential person for this many years. But really just bringing public awareness to the local history that you might walk past every day but not really notice is kind of the first step, I would say, in trying to get something preserved.
Has it typically been smooth work in conjunction with the community and these resources such as public libraries or historical societies by the state? Has it always been a smooth operation getting these historical sites set up?
I think it depends what you want to commemorate. because sometimes if you want to put up a marker for something the community isn't necessarily proud of or isn't it makes them uncomfortable, you'll probably struggle with that.
Have there been instances of that in Iowa City?
I don't know of Iowa City specifically. I know that we tend to, it's not a problem people often run into when they're doing these historical markers is it can kind of get very like rose-colored glasses of like, oh, look at this person who made a change, but they don't want to talk about why they had to make a change in the first place. So I know in Iowa City we have pretty solid guesses on that there were a couple Underground Railroad houses in Iowa City. We don't exactly know 100% where they were or who owned them and operated them. But if you wanted to put up a plaque for the Underground Railroad, people would probably be excited to talk about that and think that that's very cool, but they're going to be way less hesitant to put up a plaque over, a site of enslavement or maybe if we have instances of slaves being trafficked through Iowa City. So it depends on where the community is like feeling with the history, I would say.
I'm sensing that push and pull again of
yes,
Iowa.
Exactly.
Of celebration as well as just a little bit of shame in there as well.
Yes. And I think that is what's been really interesting about this job too, is that people like to talk about history, but sometimes if you get too close to what they are familiar with, they tend to get a little spooked and they get a little nervous. And so it's sort of like trying to ease people into things can be celebrated and commemorated, but also things need to be remembered because they aren't great as well.
Shifting back to the museum itself a little bit, modern movements, I suppose, I can't pinpoint like a specific decade, but it seems that modern movements for Black liberation have kind of shifted to include more conversations about Black culture and maybe connecting ties back to African roots and a sense of cultural healing. How does the museum interact with this cultural aspect of Black liberation?
Yeah. Something that has been really great about both our board and like our staffing team is that we really like to push the envelope of what people expect us to do in terms of our exhibits or our events. And so we try to keep it connected to history and like kind of giving people that bedrock of like, this is what was happening in Iowa Black history. But in my experience, at least, when you can take it a step further and bring it into the present day and talk about how the like specific issues that Black Americans are facing have come out of these historical layers, that is when we have like our best community discussions and like our community events. And so we recently finished a traveling exhibit on redlining, which is up in Bettendorf and Mason City right now. But a big part of our redlining exhibit isn't just, oh, look at how bad the past was. Isn't that so sad? It's how do we still see the impact of housing inequality and of housing restrictions on the way Black Iowans live their lives now? Like, how do we see that in incarceration, in health and nutrition, in environmental justice? So I think that what we really like to do is kind of connect in with what are problems people are still talking about and how can we give you that historical backing to help answer that question. So we've had exhibits on the school to prison pipeline, on the history of Black hair, on the history, or we had an event on Black agriculture. So we try to keep it a little bit of both, a little present day, a little historical.
And I know the museum offers many educational resources, some for specifically designed for classrooms and some just for the community at large. What are some of the resources that the community can tap into?
Yes. So on our website, we have all of our traveling exhibits displayed. And so these are really great we do a lot of public libraries get the traveling exhibits. They're not too crazy big, but they offer kind of a condensed version of one of our temporary exhibits. And so they can give you a nice little, like, long-standing, continuous educational effort. And then we also do adult and children's programming that's run by myself. And we cover everything from like the history of Black sports in Iowa to housing to I'm doing one on music today at a senior citizen home.
Are these like classes to attend?
Yeah, they're like an hour long, nothing too crazy. But yeah, so we like to try to keep it as transparent as possible. We like to try to keep our events as low cost as possible. But we also like to go all around the state. So you don't have to be just in the Iowa City, Cedar Rapids area to access a lot of our resources.
Now, the museum was founded as largely a community movement. What is the mission of the museum today?
Yeah, so our kind of official mission statement is to preserve and educate Iowans on Iowa's Black history. And kind of the first step in that is people don't know that there's a Black history of Iowa, especially, I mean, I'm not from Iowa, and so when I first moved here, I was like, what does that look like? Like, what does Black history in Iowa look like? And so kind of giving people the resources to know their state and then to know sort of how these historical actions and actors have impacted the present day. But we also are around to help preserve people's like family papers, to preserve people's historical memorabilia, and we are just excited to be able, we like to hear community feedback. So if you have an idea for something, like we want to hear it. But yeah, our main goal is to just make sure that there is like a physical location that someone can come to and be like, I don't know anything about Black Iowa history. Like, what does that look like? And like, we can give you that.
All right. Well, Miss Sydney O'Hare, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much.
It was really well, very informative. Where can people reach the museum in terms of feedback?
Yeah, so our website is blackiowa.org. We are hopefully reopening mid or end of April, depending on how the rest of our renovation project goes. We're right by Nouveau City Market in Cedar Rapids. But all of our events are on our Facebook page or our Instagram. Blackiowa.org. Best way to find us.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.